Deep in the black void between star systems, where even the bravest spacefaring species dare not venture alone, humanity's greatest strength isn't their weapons or their ships. It's their stubborn refusal to abandon those who need help. When senior mechanic Jake Morrison receives a direct order to ignore a distress signal from an unknown alien vessel, he faces a choice that will either save innocent lives or end his career in the Terran Defense Corps forever. What he discovers in the wreckage of that drifting ship will challenge everything the galaxy thinks it knows about humans, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't a warrior with a plasma rifle. It's a mechanic with a conscience and a toolbox full of impossible solutions. The alien cubs aboard that dying vessel have never encountered a human before. They're about to learn why the rest of the galaxy both fears and respects the species that calls itself humanity. The emergency klaxon peers through the steady hum of the TDF Meridian's engine room like a knife through steel. Senior mechanic Jake Morrison looked up from the plasma conduit he was rewiring, his weathered hands steady despite the blaring alarm. 23 years of service in the Terran Defense Corps had taught him that panic killed more spacers than enemy fire ever would. Morrison, report to the bridge immediately, crackled through the ship's comm system. Captain Hendrick's voice carried that particular edge that meant trouble was brewing somewhere in the void. Jake wiped his hands on his coveralls and made his way through the ship's corridors. The Meridian was a Hercules-class engineering vessel, built more for repair work than combat, but she was sturdy and reliable. Her crew of 47 souls had been Jake's family for the better part of 5 years, and he knew every bolt, circuit, and weld seam in her hull. The bridge buzzed with tense activity when he arrived. Navigation Officer Chun was hunched over her console, fingers dancing across holographic displays showing stellar coordinates. Tactical Officer Reynolds monitored the sensor arrays, his jaw tight with concentration. At the center of it all, Captain Sarah Hendricks stood with her arms crossed, staring at the main view screen. "Jake, we've got a situation," the captain began without turning around. Long-range sensors picked up a distress signal approximately 4 light hours from our current position. Unknown vessel, alien configuration, but the universal distress code is clear. Jake stepped forward, studying the tactical display. The signal was weak but consistent, pulsing in the standardized pattern recognized by all spacefaring civilizations. "What's our ETA if we change course?" 6 hours at maximum burn, Chun reported. "But that's not why you're here." Captain Hendricks finally turned to face him, and Jake could see the conflict in her eyes. "Fleet Command has issued direct orders. We're to maintain course to the Proxima Station and ignore the distress signal." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. In all his years of service, he had never known the Terran Defense Corps to ignore a legitimate distress call. It went against everything the organization stood for, everything humanity claimed to represent in the galactic community. "Ignore it." Jake's voice came out sharper than he intended. "Captain, with respect, that goes against every protocol we've sworn to uphold." "I'm aware of that, Jake." Hendricks moved to her command chair, but didn't sit down. "The orders come from Admiral Voss himself. Apparently, there's been increased hegemony activity in this sector, and Fleet Command doesn't want us getting caught in a potential ambush." Jake knew about the hegemony. Most of the galaxy did. A coalition of militant alien species that viewed humanity's rapid expansion with suspicion and hostility. They'd been responsible for several attacks on human colonies in recent months, always striking civilian targets and vanishing before military forces could respond. "Have we identified the ship's origin?" Jake asked. Reynolds pulled up additional sensor data. "Negative. The design doesn't match any known species in our databases. Could be a previously unknown civilization or possibly a heavily modified vessel from a known species." The bridge fell silent except for the soft hum of electronic systems. Jake could feel the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing down on everyone present. The crew of the Meridian had signed up to help people, to be the ones who arrived when everything seemed hopeless and made the impossible possible. How many life signs? Jake asked quietly. Shun consulted her readings. Difficult to determine due to distance and unknown biosignatures, but preliminary scans suggest fewer than a dozen. Fewer than a dozen lives hanging in the balance while they debated orders and protocols. Jake thought about his daughter Sarah back on Earth, named after the captain who had given him his first break in the Corps. She was 12 now, old enough to understand what her father did for a living, old enough to be proud that he helped save people among the stars. Captain, Jake said carefully, what if we experienced a minor engineering malfunction, something that required us to drop out of hyperspace to conduct repairs? Hendricks raised an eyebrow. That would delay our arrival at Proxima Station. Might take us several hours to get the problem sorted out, Jake continued. Could drift quite a bit off course during repairs. The captain studied him for a long moment. Around the bridge, the other officers pretended to be absorbed in their duties while listening to every word. Mr. Morrison, Hendricks said formally, what's the status of our primary hyperdrive motivator? Jake moved to the engineering console and pulled up the relevant displays. His fingers moved across the interface with practiced efficiency, accessing systems that would normally require hours of diagnostic work to evaluate properly. Well, would you look at that? He said, injecting just the right amount of concern into his voice. Looks like we've got some irregularities in the quantum field alignment. Nothing dangerous, but definitely something we need to address before making any long-range jumps. How long for repairs? The captain asked. Hard to say. Could be anywhere from 4 to 8 hours, depending on what we find when I get in there. Hendricks nodded slowly. Very well. Drop us out of hyperspace and begin diagnostic procedures. Navigator, plot our current position relative to any nearby distress signals. Already done, Captain, Chin replied with just a hint of smile. Funny thing is, our current drift trajectory puts us within range of that unknown vessel's position. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Jake actually did perform real maintenance on the hyperdrive, partly to maintain the fiction and partly because the Meridian could always use the attention. But his mind was focused on the approaching rescue operation. As they drew closer to the distressed vessel, the details became clearer and more disturbing. The ship was roughly cylindrical, about 300 meters long, with organic-looking curves that suggested biotech construction. Most importantly, it was clearly dying. Hull breaches vented atmosphere into space in crystalline clouds, and large sections of the vessel showed signs of explosion damage. Jesus, Reynolds whispered as the main screen displayed the full scope of the destruction. What the hell happened to them? Energy weapon signatures consistent with hegemony plasma cannons, Chen reported grimly. Looks like they got hit hard and fast. Jake felt his stomach tighten. The hegemony had been here, which meant Fleet Command's concerns about an ambush weren't entirely unfounded. But it also meant that whoever was aboard that ship had already faced the enemy and survived this long against terrible odds. Life signs? Captain Hendricks asked. Still reading multiple biosignatures, but they're weak and scattered throughout the ship, Reynolds replied. Some sections are completely without power or atmosphere. Jake studied the tactical display, his mind automatically cataloging the damage and calculating repair priorities. Captain, request permission to prep a boarding party. That ship's not going to stay intact much longer. Granted, take Petty Officer Williams and Specialist Patel. Full environmental suits and emergency medical supplies. As Jake headed for the airlock, he caught the captain's eye. She gave him a barely perceptible nod that spoke volumes. Whatever consequences came from disobeying Fleet Command, they would face them together. The boarding shuttle detached from the Meridian with Jake at the controls, Williams handling communications, and Patel monitoring life support systems. As they approached the alien vessel, the extent of the damage became even more apparent. The ship's hull was riddled with holes, some large enough to fly the shuttle through. Finding a safe docking point is going to be tricky, Williams observed. There, Jake pointed to what appeared to be an intact airlock about midway along the vessel's length. Bioscanners show atmosphere on the other side, and the structural integrity looks solid. The docking procedure took nearly 20 minutes of careful maneuvering. The alien ship's systems were either too damaged or too foreign to communicate with their shuttle's automated docking protocols, forcing Jake to rely on manual controls and his own experience. The airlock eventually cycled, revealing a corridor that was definitely not designed for human-sized beings. The ceiling was too low, forcing them to duck, while the walls curved inward in a way that suggested the ship's builders were significantly smaller than humans. Air's breathable, Patel reported after checking his scanner. High oxygen content, slightly elevated CO2 levels, but nothing our filters can't handle. They moved deeper into the ship, following the strongest life sign readings. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows through the organic-looking corridors, and Jake noticed that many of the surfaces showed signs of recent damage. Claw marks and what looked like burn marks from energy weapons scarred the walls. They fought back, Williams observed, noting the same damage. Whatever happened here wasn't just a one-sided attack. The first body they found was an adult alien, roughly humanoid, but covered in what looked like natural armor plating. The being was clearly deceased, clutching what appeared to be some kind of energy weapon. Jake knelt beside the body, studying the unfamiliar physiology. 4 arms, natural armor, extended cranium, he reported for the record. Looks like they were built for combat. Jake, Patel called from further down the corridor. You need to see this. Jake joined Patel at what appeared to be a blast door, partially sealed but with enough of a gap to see through. On the other side, huddled together in what looked like a defensive formation, were 6 small aliens. Cubs, Jake realized with the start. They were juveniles of the same species, their armor plating not yet fully developed, their large eyes reflecting the emergency lighting as they stared back at the humans. The cubs were making soft vocalizations, clearly distressed, but not quite panicked. One of them, slightly larger than the others, positioned itself between the humans and the smaller cubs in what was unmistakably a protective stance. They're kids, Williams said softly. Just kids. Jake studied the blast door mechanism. The alien technology was foreign, but the basic principles were universal. Something had sealed them in there, probably during the attack. The adult aliens had sacrificed themselves to protect the young. Can you get them out? Patel asked. Jake was already pulling tools from his kit. Give me 10 minutes. Working on alien technology required a combination of technical knowledge, intuition, and pure stubborn determination. Jake had all 3 in abundance. The door's locking mechanism was sophisticated but followed logical principles. Power conduits led to control nodes. Control nodes responded to specific input sequences, and input sequences could be bypassed if you knew where to apply the right pressure. The breakthrough came when Jake realized that the door wasn't just locked. It was programmed to only open for specific biosignatures. The adult aliens had locked their cubs away from danger so completely that they couldn't get out even if they wanted to. Got it, Jake muttered, rerouting power through a secondary circuit he'd jury-rigged from his portable toolkit. The blast door shuddered, then slowly began to iris open. The cubs immediately backed away, their vocalizations becoming more urgent. The largest one spread its arms wide, trying to shield the others despite the obvious futility of the gesture. Jake holstered his tools and slowly removed his helmet, knowing that the ship's atmosphere was safe to breathe. He wanted the cubs to see his face, to understand that he meant no harm. Hey there, he said in the gentlest tone he could manage. It's okay. We're here to help. The cubs stared at him with enormous eyes, clearly processing this new development. Jake slowly reached into his kit and pulled out an emergency ration bar, unwrapping it and taking a bite to demonstrate that it was food and that he trusted it enough to eat it himself. He placed the ration bar on the floor between himself and the cubs, then backed away. The largest cub watched him carefully, then looked back at the others. After what felt like an eternity, one of the smaller cubs crept forward and cautiously took the food. That's it, Jake said softly. We're the good guys. We're going to get you out of here. The rescue operation took 3 more hours. The cubs were weak from hunger and dehydration, but they were alive and responsive to basic medical care. Patel worked tirelessly to establish communication protocols, while Williams coordinated with the Meridian to prepare quarantine facilities. Jake found himself focusing on the smallest of the cubs, who seemed to have bonded with him during the initial contact. The little alien, Jake had started thinking of it as Pip, though he had no idea of its actual gender or name, stayed close to his side throughout the evacuation process. As they prepared to leave the dying ship, Jake took one last look around. This vessel represented an unknown civilization, a species that had encountered humanity's enemies and paid a terrible price. The cubs were survivors, but they were also refugees now, dependent on the kindness of strangers who didn't even speak their language. Back aboard the Meridian, Captain Hendricks met them at the airlock. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Jake could see the questions in her eyes. 6 survivors, all juveniles, he reported. The adults appear to have died defending them during what looks like a hegemony attack. And our orders regarding distress calls? Jake met her gaze steadily. I believe our hyperdrive malfunction has been fully repaired, Captain. We're ready to resume course to Proxima Station whenever you give the word. Hendricks nodded. Very well. But first, I think we need to ensure our guests are properly cared for. Dr. Martinez is already preparing medical facilities, and I've sent a full report to Fleet Command about our unexpected passengers. As Jake headed to the medical bay to check on the cubs, he felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. They had saved lives, which was what they had sworn to do. But they had also defied direct orders, and there would be consequences for that choice. In the medical bay, he found the cubs clustered together in one corner, still clearly frightened but no longer actively panicking. Dr. Martinez was slowly gaining their trust with food and gentle medical attention, while Pip sat apart from the others, watching the door as if waiting for something. When Jake entered, Pip immediately moved toward him, making soft chittering sounds that almost sounded like questions. Jake knelt down and let the small alien approach, careful not to make any sudden movements. You're safe now, he said, even though he knew Pip couldn't understand the words. We're going to take care of you. As if responding to his tone, Pip reached out with one small, clawed hand and touched Jake's arm. The gesture was unmistakably one of trust, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest. These weren't just survivors they had rescued. They were individuals, each with their own personality and fears and hopes for the future. Whatever came next, whatever consequences Fleet Command might impose for their disobedience, Jake knew he would make the same choice again. Some things were more important than orders, more important than protocols or regulations or the careful political calculations of military command. Sometimes, the right thing to do was simply to help when help was needed, regardless of the cost. The Cubs had been aboard the Meridian for 18 hours when Fleet Command's response arrived. Jake was in Engineering Bay 2, which had been hastily converted into a play area of sorts for their young passengers, when the communication came through. Morrison, report to the captain's ready room immediately, the ship's comm announced. Jake looked up from the improvised puzzle he'd been working on with Pip and 2 of the other Cubs. They had proven remarkably intelligent, quickly grasping the basic concepts behind human tools and technology. Pip in particular seemed fascinated by anything mechanical, often watching Jake's hands intently when he demonstrated how various devices worked. I'll be back, he told the Cubs, knowing they couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone would reassure them. Pip chittered softly and touched his hand again, a gesture that had become their informal way of saying goodbye. The walk to the captain's ready room felt longer than usual. Jake had been expecting this summons since they'd first picked up the distress signal. Fleet Command didn't take kindly to subordinates who interpreted orders creatively, especially when those interpretations resulted in direct disobedience. Captain Hendricks was standing by the viewport when he entered, her hands clasped behind her back as she stared out at the stars. A holographic message pad flickered on her desk, displaying the official seal of Terran Defense Corps High Command. "Sit down, Jake," she said without turning around. He took the chair across from her desk and waited. After a moment, she turned and activated the holographic display. Admiral Voss appeared in miniature, his weathered face set in stern lines. "Captain Hendricks," the recorded message began, "I have reviewed your report regarding the rescue of alien survivors. While I understand your crew's humanitarian impulses, the fact remains that you directly violated explicit orders to maintain course and avoid potential hostile contact." Jake felt his stomach clench, but he kept his expression neutral. The Admiral continued, "However, the intelligence value of first contact with a previously unknown species, particularly one that has been attacked by hegemony forces, cannot be overlooked. Your actions, while unauthorized, have provided us with unprecedented opportunities for gathering information about our enemy's activities." Hendricks paused the message and looked at Jake. "He's not finished, but I wanted you to hear this part. We're not being court-martialed, at least not yet. But we are being reassigned." "Reassigned?" She resumed the message. Admiral Voss reappeared. "The Meridian is hereby ordered to proceed immediately to Research Station Omega-7 in the Centauri system. Dr. Elena Vasquez, our chief xenobiologist, will be waiting to begin comprehensive studies of your passengers. Additionally, a full diplomatic team is being assembled to attempt communication and establish formal relations." The message ended abruptly. Jake sat in silence for a moment, processing the implications. "Research Station Omega-7, he said finally. "That's a military research facility." "Among other things," Hendricks confirmed. "Dr. Vasquez is good at her job, but she's also a military scientist first. These cubs are going to become test subjects whether we like it or not." Jake felt a surge of anger. "They're not specimens. They're kids who just lost their families. I know that, and you know that. But to Fleet Command, they're intelligence assets and potential sources of information about hegemony tactics and technology." The captain moved to her desk and pulled up star charts showing their new course. "We have 48 hours before we reach Omega-7. That's not much time to prepare the Cubs for what's coming." Jake studied the navigational data, his mind already working on the problem. 48 hours wasn't long, but it might be enough to make a difference. "What kind of preparation did you have in mind?" Hendricks met his gaze. "The kind that ensures these Cubs have someone looking out for their interests when the scientists start asking questions. Dr. Vasquez is brilliant, but she's never had kids of her own. She might not understand the difference between research and care. You want me to stay with them. I want you to request a transfer to the research station as their primary caretaker and cultural liaison. Officially, you'll be there to help with technical analysis of their ship's remains and any technology we can salvage. Unofficially, you'll be their advocate." Jake considered the implications. A transfer to a research station would effectively end his career as a starship engineer. Research stations were career dead ends, places where officers went when they weren't suitable for frontline service anymore. But the alternative was leaving the Cubs to navigate an alien bureaucracy without anyone who understood their needs. "I'll submit the request within the hour," he said. "Good. Now about the Cubs themselves. How are they adapting?" Jake's expression softened as he thought about his time with them over the past day. "Better than expected. They're incredibly intelligent and surprisingly resilient. Pip especially has been learning human gestures and even some basic tool use. They seem to have a natural aptitude for engineering and mechanical concepts." "Any progress on communication?" "Some. Dr. Martinez has been working with them on basic mathematical concepts, and they've proven capable of understanding abstract numerical relationships. Their vocal range is different from ours, but they seem to be trying to mimic some of our sounds." Hendricks nodded. "That's more progress than most first contact situations achieve in the first week, let alone the first day. These Cubs might be special in more ways than we initially realized." Jake stood to leave, then paused. "Captain, what happens if Dr. Vasquez's research determines that their species poses a threat to humanity?" The question hung in the air between them. First contact protocols were clear about potential threats, and The cub's natural armor and claw structure certainly suggested a species evolved for combat. Add to that their apparent intelligence and technical aptitude, and they could potentially represent a significant strategic concern. That's a bridge we'll cross when we come to it, Hendricks replied. For now, focus on making sure those cubs understand that not all humans are the same. Some of us still believe in doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. Jake returned to Engineering Bay 2 to find the cubs engaged in what appeared to be a group problem-solving exercise. They had taken apart one of the portable diagnostic tools and were carefully examining each component, chittering to each other in their musical language. Learning by doing, Dr. Martinez observed from where she stood monitoring them. Their approach to understanding new technology is remarkably systematic. They're not just randomly exploring. They're following logical investigation patterns. Jake knelt down beside Pip, who immediately showed him a circuit board for the diagnostic tool. The young alien pointed to various components and made questioning sounds, clearly asking for explanations. That's a processing matrix, Jake explained, pointing to the relevant section. It takes input data and converts it into usable information. He pulled out a simplified circuit diagram from his toolkit and began sketching the data flow with his finger. Pip watched intently, then took the stylus from Jake's hand and began making its own marks on the diagram. The additions were crude, but showed a clear understanding of the underlying principles. More importantly, they suggested improvements to the circuit design that Jake hadn't considered. That's actually a better configuration, he admitted, studying Pip's modifications. More efficient data routing, reduced processing overhead. Dr. Martinez leaned in to look. Jake, how long did it take you to understand circuit optimization when you were learning engineering? Years, Jake replied honestly. And I had formal training and human instructors. Pip has been exposed to human technology for less than 24 hours. The implication was clear. These cubs weren't just intelligent. They were exceptionally gifted in technical fields. That made them even more valuable as research subjects, but it also made Jake more determined to protect them from exploitation. Over the next 2 days, Jake spent every available moment with the cubs. He taught them basic human concepts, introduced them to various tools and technologies, and slowly began to understand their own methods of communication and problem-solving. They were remarkably social creatures, constantly sharing information and resources among themselves. When one cub learned something new, the knowledge quickly spread to the others through a combination of gestures, vocalizations, and what appeared to be shared tactile experiences. Pip remained the most curious and outgoing of the group, but Jake began to recognize individual personalities among all of them. There was Dancer, who seemed to have an intuitive understanding of mechanical rhythms and timing. Builder showed remarkable spatial reasoning abilities and could visualize complex three-dimensional structures with ease. Spark had an apparent affinity for electrical systems, while Echo seemed to excel at pattern recognition and analysis. The sixth cub, whom Jake had started calling Quiet, was different from the others. Smaller and more reserved, Quiet rarely participated in the group's technical explorations. Instead, this cub seemed to focus on observing the humans, studying their behavior and emotional responses with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Quiet might be their equivalent of psychologist or social scientist, Dr. Martinez suggested when Jake mentioned his observations. Many species develop specialized roles within their social groups. If these cubs represent different aptitudes or potential career paths, it would explain their diverse approaches to learning. The theory made sense, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about what would happen to them at the research station. Would they be kept together as a social unit, or would they be separated for individual study? Would their specialized abilities be nurtured and developed, or simply cataloged and analyzed? As they approached Research Station Omega-7, Jake made a decision. He gathered all 6 cubs in Engineering Bay 2 and began what he hoped would be their first lesson in human politics and bureaucracy. Using simple diagrams and careful gestures, He tried to explain that they were about to meet new humans who might not be as friendly or patient as the crew of the Meridian. He demonstrated concepts like authority and research using toy figures and improvised scenarios. The cubs watched intently, occasionally chittering among themselves in what Jake had come to recognize as their planning discussions. When he finished his explanation, Pip approached him and made a series of complex gestures that Jake interpreted as questions about safety and protection. "I'll be there," Jake promised, even though he wasn't entirely sure he could keep that promise. "I'll do everything I can to make sure you're treated fairly." Pip seemed to consider this, then moved to confer with the other cubs. Their discussion was longer and more animated than usual, involving all 6 of them in what appeared to be a vigorous debate. Finally, Quiet approached Jake and made a gesture he had never seen before, all 4 arms extended in what could only be described as an embrace. "I think," Dr. Martinez said softly, "they're trying to tell you something important." Jake knelt down and let Quiet complete the gesture. The small alien's arms were surprisingly strong, and Jake could feel what seemed like a vibration or purring coming from Quiet's chest. When Quiet stepped back, all 6 cubs lined up in front of Jake and performed the same gesture in unison. It was clearly some kind of formal acknowledgement or acceptance, a ritual that carried deep meaning in their culture. "I don't know what I just agreed to," Jake said, "but I'm pretty sure it was important." Research Station Omega-7 was a massive structure built into a captured asteroid, its docking facilities designed to accommodate everything from single-person shuttles to fleet supply ships. The Meridian was directed to a secure berth in the station's military section, away from the civilian research areas. Dr. Elena Vasquez was waiting for them at the airlock, accompanied by a team of technicians and what were obviously security personnel. She was a tall, severe-looking woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of focused intensity that Jake associated with career researchers. "Captain Hendricks," she said briskly, "I trust your passengers are ready for immediate transfer to our containment facilities?" "Containment?" Jake stepped forward before the captain could respond. "These are children, not prisoners." "Dr." Vasquez turned her attention to him with the kind of look usually reserved for interesting but minor specimens. "Senior Mechanic Morrison, I presume. I've read your report. Your emotional attachment to these subjects is noted, but irrelevant to our research objectives." "Subjects?" Jake's voice carried more heat than he intended. "They're intelligent beings who just lost their families. They deserve better than being treated like lab animals." "What they deserve," Dr. Vasquez replied coldly, "is proper scientific study so that we can understand their capabilities and potential threat level. Your sentimental approach may have been adequate for temporary care, but now we need real answers." Captain Hendricks intervened before the confrontation could escalate further. "Dr. Vasquez, I believe you've been informed of Mr. Morrison's transfer request. He's been working closely with the Cubs and has made significant progress in establishing communication protocols." "Yes, I'm aware of his request. It's been approved primarily because his technical background will be useful in analyzing the alien vessel's remains. However, his access to the subjects will be strictly regulated and supervised." Jake felt his temper rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting into an argument with the head researcher wouldn't help the Cubs, and it might result in him being removed from the station entirely. "I understand," he said carefully. "When can I see them?" "After initial processing and medical evaluation. We need to establish baseline health parameters and conduct preliminary psychological assessments before allowing any outside contact." The Cubs were transferred from the Meridian in individual transport containers, sedated for their own safety, according to Dr. Vasquez. Jake watched helplessly as his young friends were wheeled away by technicians who handled them like cargo rather than living beings. "This is wrong," he told Captain Hendricks as they watched the containers disappear into the station's interior. "I know," she replied quietly, "but sometimes wrong is the price we pay for getting the chance to make things right later. Don't lose sight of the long game, Jake." These cubs need someone on the inside who cares about them as individuals. As the Meridian prepared to depart for its next assignment, Jake found himself alone on a research station full of strangers, responsible for protecting 6 alien children from the very people who were supposed to be helping them. It was going to be a long assignment. 3 weeks into his assignment at Research Station Omega-7, Jake Morrison had learned to hate the sound of his own footsteps in the sterile corridors. The station's environmental systems maintained perfect temperature and humidity, but somehow the air always felt cold against his skin. He was making his daily trek to Lab Section C when Dr. Martinez's voice crackled through his personal communicator. "Jake, you need to get down here immediately. Something's happening with the cubs." Jake broke into a run, his engineering boots echoing off the polished metal walls. In the 3 weeks since their arrival, he had been allowed exactly 47 minutes of supervised contact with the cubs, distributed across brief sessions where Dr. Vasquez or one of her assistants monitored every interaction. The cubs had been separated into individual containment cells for optimal research conditions, despite Jake's repeated protests that their species was clearly social and suffered from isolation. His objections had been noted and dismissed. Lab Section C was in chaos when he arrived. Emergency lights flashed red, and 3 security guards stood outside the cubs' containment area with their weapons drawn. Through the reinforced transparent walls, Jake could see 5 of the cubs huddled together in the center cell, while the 6th cell stood empty with its door hanging open. "Where's Pip?" Jake demanded, pushing past the guards. Dr. Vasquez emerged from a side corridor, her usually pristine lab coat stained with what looked like lubricant fluid. The subject, designated as Primary Test Case Alpha, has escaped containment and is currently loose in the station's maintenance systems. Escaped? Jake stared at her. How does a kid escape from a maximum security research facility? By demonstrating technical capabilities that far exceed our initial assessments, Dr. Vasquez replied grimly. The subject somehow managed to override the electronic lock on its containment cell, using nothing but components cannibalized from the food dispensing unit. Jake looked at the damaged cell door and felt a surge of pride mixed with worry. The locking mechanism was a standard military-grade system that should have been impossible to breach without proper tools and extensive technical knowledge. Pip had managed it with spare parts and determination. How long has he been missing? 43 minutes. We've sealed all major access routes, but the maintenance tunnels throughout this section are extensive. The subject could be anywhere. Jake studied the layout of the lab section on a wall-mounted schematic. Research Station Omega-7 had been built over several decades, with new sections added as needed. The result was a maze of maintenance corridors, service tunnels, and access shafts that even the station's original designers probably didn't fully understand. What was Pip working on before this happened? Jake asked. Dr. Vasquez consulted her tablet. The subject had been given a series of mechanical puzzles designed to test problem-solving abilities and manual dexterity. It completed the entire battery of tests in 6 minutes. 6 minutes? Jake looked at the remaining cubs, all of whom were pressed against the transparent walls of their cells, chittering anxiously to each other. How long were those tests supposed to take? The average adult human requires between 2 and 4 hours, Dr. Martinez answered quietly. Jake, these cubs aren't just intelligent. They're operating on a completely different cognitive level than we initially realized. Jake moved to the cubs' cells and knelt down so he could make eye contact with them. Immediately, all 5 began making urgent gestures and vocalizations that he recognized as distress calls. They're trying to tell me something, Jake said. About Pip, about where he went. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, I must remind you that unauthorized communication with the test subjects is strictly test subjects. Jake stood up abruptly, his patience finally reaching its limit. These are children, scared, lonely children who've been locked in cages for 3 weeks while you poke and prod them like they're specimens in a museum. Their emotional state is irrelevant to our research objectives, Dr. Vasquez replied coldly. What matters is understanding their capabilities and determining whether their species represents a threat to human security. The only threat here is the way you're treating them. Jake turned back to the cubs and began making the hand gestures he had learned during their time on the Meridian. Slowly, the cubs began to respond, their agitation decreasing as they recognized familiar communication patterns. Builder approached the wall and began sketching something on the transparent surface with one clawed finger. The drawing was crude, but clearly showed the layout of the lab section from above, with particular attention to the ventilation and power distribution systems. He's in the service tunnels, Jake realized, but not randomly. He's following the power grid. Echo joined Builder at the wall and added more details to the drawing, including what appeared to be junction boxes and access panels. The other cubs contributed their own elements, building a comprehensive map of the station's infrastructure that was far more detailed than anything in the official schematics. How do they know all this? Dr. Martinez asked in amazement. Jake studied the collaborative drawing and felt pieces clicking into place. They've been listening. All those weeks in containment, they've been mapping the station by sound. The hum of power systems, the vibration of air recyclers, the acoustic signatures of different machinery. Dr. Vasquez moved closer to examine the drawing. Despite her clinical approach to the cubs, she was still a scientist, and the implications of what they were seeing clearly intrigued her. If this map is accurate, she said slowly, they've demonstrated spatial reasoning and acoustic analysis capabilities that exceed anything in our theoretical models. Quiet stepped forward and began adding new elements to the drawing. Human figures in various locations throughout the station. The detail was extraordinary, showing not just where people were, but their patterns of movement and behavior. They've been studying us as much as we've been studying them, Jake realized. They know the guard rotations, the shift changes, even individual behavioral patterns. Dr. Vasquez paled slightly as the full implications hit her. If they can observe and analyze human behavior to this degree, they're not planning an escape. Jake interrupted, understanding finally, dawning. Pip isn't running away. He's going after something specific. Jake traced the power grid pathway shown in the Cubs' drawing, following the route that Pip would most likely take through the service tunnels. The path led directly to the station's central computer core, where all research data was stored and processed. He's going for the research files, Jake said. He wants to know what you've learned about his people. The security alert klaxon began blaring throughout the lab section, followed by an announcement from the station's central control. Attention, all personnel. Unauthorized access detected in Computer Core 7. Security teams report to Level 12 immediately. Dr. Vasquez grabbed her communicator. Security control, this is Dr. Vasquez. The intruder is likely the escaped alien subject. Exercise extreme caution, but do not use lethal force. The subject is extremely valuable for research purposes. Jake felt sick listening to her reduce Pip to a valuable research asset. But he also realized that her concern for preserving Pip's research value might be the only thing keeping the security teams from treating this as a hostile incursion. I need to get down there, Jake said. If Pip is cornered, he might panic and hurt himself trying to escape. Absolutely not, Dr. Vasquez replied. You're emotionally compromised where these subjects are concerned. Security personnel are trained to handle this type of situation. Security personnel are trained to handle hostile intruders. Jake shot back. Pip isn't hostile. He's a scared kid who's been locked up for weeks without contact with his family. If they corner him with weapons drawn, they'll either terrify him into doing something dangerous or provoke him into defending himself. Dr. Martinez stepped between them. Elena, Jake's right about this. These cubs have shown remarkable intelligence and emotional complexity. Military tactics aren't appropriate for dealing with a frightened child, regardless of species. Dr. Vasquez considered for a moment, then activated her communicator again. Security control, add technical specialist Morrison to the response team. He has experience communicating with the subject and may be useful in facilitating peaceful resolution. Jake didn't wait for further authorization. He headed for the nearest maintenance access panel, pulling out his toolkit as he went. If Pip was in the service tunnels, the fastest way to reach him was through the same route. The maintenance tunnels of Research Station Omega-7 were a claustrophobic maze of pipes, conduits, and access shafts. Jake had spent enough time maintaining similar systems to navigate them efficiently, but he found himself impressed by Pip's ability to find his way through the labyrinth. As he crawled through a particularly narrow section, Jake began to hear familiar chittering sounds echoing through the metalwork. Pip was close, and he didn't sound distressed. If anything, the vocalizations suggested focused concentration. Jake emerged from an access shaft into a larger service corridor just as the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting everything in red shadows. Somewhere in the distance, alarms began sounding. "Pip," Jake called softly. "It's me, Jake. Are you okay?" The chittering stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of rapid movement through the overhead conduits. A moment later, Pip dropped down from a ventilation grate, landing with surprising grace for someone who had been confined for weeks. The young alien looked different than Jake remembered. 3 weeks of separation and stress had changed him, made him more wary and calculating. But when Pip saw Jake, his posture relaxed slightly, and he made the soft greeting sound that Jake recognized as their informal hello. "What are you doing down here?" Jake asked, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. Pip moved to a nearby access panel and gestured for Jake to follow. Inside the panel was a mass of rewired circuits and jury-rig connections that looked like the work of a master engineer with decades of experience. "You've been modifying the station's systems," Jake realized, "not just accessing them, improving them." Pip chittered softly and pointed to a portable display unit he had somehow acquired and modified. The screen showed data streams that Jake recognized as research files from the xenobiology department, but also personnel records, security protocols, and communication logs. "You've been gathering intelligence," Jake said with growing amazement. "You know everything that's been happening on this station since you arrived." Pip manipulated the display controls with his 4 hands, bringing up specific files that made Jake's blood run cold. Detailed anatomical studies, genetic analysis reports, psychological evaluation summaries, and, most disturbing of all, preliminary recommendations for enhanced interrogation protocols. "They're planning to hurt you," Jake said quietly. "All of you." Pip's response was a complex series of gestures that Jake interpreted as a question about human intentions and methods. The young alien had clearly learned enough about human language to understand far more than he had previously let on. "Some humans," Jake said carefully, "believe that understanding requires control. They think that to study something properly, they need to break it down into pieces and examine each part separately." Pip considered this, then showed Jake another set of files. These contained communication intercept from Fleet Command, discussing the potential military applications of alien biotechnology and the possibility of developing new weapons based on the Cub's natural abilities. "That's not going to happen," Jake said firmly. "I won't let them use you or your family for weapons research." Pip looked at him intently, then made a gesture that Jake recognized as a question about alternatives or choices. "We're getting you out of here," Jake decided. "All of you. Tonight." The sound of approaching security teams echoed through the service corridors, getting closer by the minute. Jake and Pip had maybe 5 minutes before they would be discovered and separated again. "Can you get back to the others?" Jake asked. Pip nodded and pointed to a route through the ventilation system that would take him directly to Lab Section C. "Good. I need you to tell them to be ready to move when I give the signal." "Can you do that?" Another nod, followed by a brief gesture that Jake interpreted as a question about timing. 1 hour, Jake said, holding up a single finger. "When the lights go out completely, that's the signal." Pip chittered once in acknowledgement, then scrambled up into the ventilation system and disappeared. Jake waited until the sound of movement faded completely, then activated his communicator. Security control, this is Morrison. The subject has moved to Section 12 Alpha. I'm in pursuit through the maintenance corridors. Copy that, Morrison. Security teams are converging on your location. Jake smiled grimly as he began making his way back toward the lab sections. He had just bought himself an hour to plan the most important engineering project of his career, breaking 6 alien children out of a maximum security research facility. The thing about being a mechanic, Jake reflected as he crawled through the maintenance tunnels, was that you learned to see systems differently than other people. Where others saw walls and barriers, he saw power grids and life support networks. Where others saw security measures, he saw vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. Research Station Omega-7 had been built to keep things in, not to keep things out. That fundamental design philosophy was about to become Dr. Vasquez's biggest problem. Jake began his preparations by accessing the station's maintenance database and downloading detailed schematics to his personal toolkit. Then, he began the delicate process of introducing small, seemingly random failures into critical systems throughout the facility. Nothing dangerous or life-threatening. Jake wasn't interested in hurting innocent people. But a research station was a complex organism that required thousands of interconnected systems to function properly. And organisms, Jake had learned over the years, could be surprisingly fragile when the right pressure was applied to the right places. By the time he made his way back to Lab Section C, the first signs of his sabotage were beginning to manifest. Environmental controls fluctuated randomly. Communication systems experienced intermittent failures. Transport lifts moved between floors according to their own mysterious logic. Dr. Vasquez and her team were too busy dealing with the cascading technical problems to pay close attention to one maintenance worker moving through their facilities with official authorization to be there. Jake's plan was simple in concept, but required precise timing and more than a little luck. At exactly 2,100 hours, during the shift change when security coverage was at its minimum, he would trigger a complete power failure in Lab Section C. In the confusion that followed, he would extract the Cubs and get them to a cargo shuttle he had already prepared in the station's loading bay. Getting off the station would be the easy part. Research Station Omega-7 was built around a captured asteroid, which meant it was surrounded by the kind of cosmic debris field that would provide perfect cover for a small, fast ship. The hard part would be everything that came after. 6 alien refugees couldn't simply disappear into human space without being noticed. They would need sanctuary, protection, and, most importantly, they would need a way to contact their own people and find safety among their own kind. Jake had been working on that problem for 3 weeks, ever since he first realized that Dr. Vasquez's research was heading in dangerous directions. The answer, when it finally came to him, was both obvious and terrifying in its implications. The Cubs' original ship had been attacked by hegemony forces, but they had survived long enough to send a distress signal that suggested their people were still alive, still fighting, and still looking for their missing children. Jake was going to help them complete that search, even if it meant defying not just Fleet Command but the entire Terran Defense Corps. At exactly 2,100 hours, Research Station Omega-7 plunged into darkness. The emergency lighting kicked in exactly 12 seconds after the main power grid failed, casting the research station in an eerie red glow that turned everything into moving shadows. Jake Morrison counted off the seconds as he made his way through the darkened corridors of Lab Section C, his modified toolkit slung across his shoulder like a weapon. The Cubs were ready for him. When he reached their containment area, he found all 6 of them clustered together in the central cell, their bioluminescent eyes glowing softly in the darkness. Pip had somehow managed to override the electronic locks on the other cells during the power failure, reuniting the group for the first time in 3 weeks. "Time to go," Jake whispered, producing a portable plasma cutter from his toolkit. The containment wall was designed to withstand significant force, but it hadn't been built to resist a sustained cutting beam applied to its structural weak points. As Jake worked, the cubs arranged themselves in what he recognized as their traveling formation. The larger ones positioned to protect the smaller ones, with Pip taking point and Quiet bringing up the rear. They moved with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of instinctive pack behavior. The wall section fell away with a soft crash that was muffled by the station's emergency klaxons. Jake stepped through the opening and gestured for the cubs to follow. They moved quickly but carefully, their natural armor plates providing protection as they navigated through the debris. Emergency teams to Lab Section C blared the station's communication system. Power failure in containment areas. All security personnel report immediately. Jake led the group through a service corridor that he had scouted earlier, avoiding the main passages where security teams would be converging. The cubs followed silently, communicating with each other through subtle gestures and soft vocalizations that wouldn't carry beyond their immediate group. They were halfway to the loading bay when Jake's communicator crackled to life. "Morrison, this is Dr. Vasquez. Respond immediately." Jake considered ignoring the call, but he realized that maintaining the fiction of his official duties might buy them crucial extra time. "Morrison here. I'm conducting emergency repairs to the power grid in Section D. The alien subjects have escaped containment. Have you seen any sign of them?" "Negative. I've been focused on getting the lights back on." Jake gestured for the cubs to take cover behind a bank of environmental processors while he continued the conversation. "How'd they get out?" "Unknown. The containment systems appear to have been sabotaged, but the method is beyond anything we thought them capable of." There was a pause, filled with background noise of shouting voices and running feet. "Morrison, I need you to abandon your current assignment and join the search. These subjects represent years of research that cannot be allowed to escape." "Understood. I'll finish securing this power junction and then join the search." Jake closed the communication and turned to find Pip watching him intently. The young alien made a complex gesture that Jake interpreted as a question about deception and trust. "Sometimes," Jake said quietly, "the right thing to do isn't the same as the honest thing to do. She wants to hurt you and your family. I'm not going to let that happen." Pip considered this for a moment, then nodded in what was unmistakably a human gesture. The cubs had been learning from their captivity, absorbing not just human technology, but human behavior patterns and social concepts. They reached the loading bay without further incident, but Jake's heart sank when he saw the additional security measures that had been implemented since the escape. The cargo shuttle he had prepared was still there, but it was now surrounded by armed guards and scanning equipment. "Plan B," Jake muttered, studying the situation from the concealment of a maintenance alcove. Builder emerged from the group and began sketching on the floor with one claw, creating a detailed diagram of the shuttle bay's layout and security positions. Echo added tactical details, while Spark indicated the locations of power systems and electronic surveillance equipment. In less than 5 minutes, the Cubs had produced a comprehensive analysis of their obstacles and possible solutions. Their collaborative approach to problem-solving was remarkable, but what impressed Jake even more was the strategic thinking behind their observations. "You're planning a diversion," he realized, studying their drawings. "Draw the guards away from the shuttle while we board from a different direction." Dancer pointed to a section of the diagram showing the loading bay's industrial equipment, massive cargo handlers, and automated systems that could be easily modified to create noise and confusion. "Can you access those systems remotely?" Jake asked. Pip nodded and produced the modified datapad he had been using to infiltrate the station's networks. His modifications had turned the simple device into a sophisticated hacking tool capable of accessing virtually any system on the station. "Give me 2 minutes to get into position," Jake said. "Then, create as much chaos as you can manage without hurting anyone." Jake made his way to the shuttle through a circuitous route that took him around the perimeter of the loading bay. The security guards were focused inward, watching for movement from the main entrance. None of them expected an approach from the service tunnels that connected to the shuttle's maintenance hatch. Jake had just finished the pre-flight sequence when the loading bay erupted into chaos. Cargo handlers began moving erratically, their mechanical arms swinging wildly as they responded to conflicting control signals. Automated loading systems activated simultaneously, creating a cacophony of grinding metal and hydraulic whines. The security guards rushed toward the disturbance, leaving the shuttle temporarily undefended. Jake opened the cargo hatch and gestured urgently to the Cubs, who appeared from concealment and sprinted toward the ship with impressive speed. They were loading into the cargo hold when Jake heard the unmistakable sound of energy weapons charging. "Stop where you are." Dr. Vasquez's voice carried clearly over the mechanical noise. She had arrived with a full security team, and they had quickly realized what was happening. Jake found himself facing a dozen armed guards, their weapons trained on him and the Cubs. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her face set in hard lines. "Mr. Morrison, you're under arrest for treason, sabotage, and theft of classified research materials. Order your alien accomplices to surrender immediately, or we will be forced to use lethal force." "They're children," Jake said, positioning himself between the guards and the Cubs. "Scared children who want to go home. They are alien assets of immeasurable strategic value," Dr. Vasquez replied coldly. "Their capabilities represent potential threats to human security that must be fully understood and contained." Jake felt the Cubs moving behind him, taking defensive positions but not retreating into the shuttle. They were prepared to fight if necessary, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. "You're afraid of them," Jake realized suddenly. "All this talk about research and strategic value. You're terrified of what they might become." Dr. Vasquez's expression flickered slightly. "Their technical abilities exceed human norms by several orders of magnitude. Left unchecked, they could develop technologies that would make human defenses obsolete. So could human children, given the right education and opportunities." Jake kept his voice calm despite the weapons pointed at him. "Intelligence isn't a crime, and neither is being different. Mr. Morrison, you have 30 seconds to order the subjects to surrender, or this situation will be resolved through other means." Jake looked back at the Cubs, who were watching the confrontation with obvious understanding despite the language barrier. They knew what was at stake, and they were prepared to trust his judgment. "There's another option," Jake said, turning back to Dr. Vasquez. "You let us leave, and in return, you get something more valuable than 6 terrified children." "I'm listening." Jake pulled out his modified datapad and activated a file transfer that sent terabytes of information directly to Dr. Vasquez's research database. Her eyes widened as she realized what she was receiving. Technical specifications for their ship's propulsion system, gravitational control mechanisms, and energy distribution networks, Jake explained. "Everything Pip downloaded from your computers, plus additional data he extracted from the wreckage of their vessel." Dr. Vasquez stared at the incoming data stream. The technological advances contained in those files represented decades of potential research and development for human science. "This is impossible," she breathed. "How could they have understood our research when they don't even speak our language?" "They understand more than you think," Jake replied. "But understanding works both ways. They know what you plan to do to them, and they're not going to cooperate with research that treats them like test subjects." Pip stepped forward and began making rapid gestures that Jake recognized as complex mathematical expressions. On the loading bay's main display screen, equations began appearing. Advanced theoretical physics that described faster-than-light travel methods far beyond current human knowledge. However, Jake continued as more information flowed across the display. They might be willing to share their knowledge voluntarily with humans who treat them as equals rather than specimens. The security guards looked uncertainly at Dr. Vasquez, who was staring at the theoretical frameworks appearing on the screen. The equations described propulsion technologies that could revolutionize space travel, energy generation methods that could solve resource scarcity, and communication systems that could link star systems in real time. "You're proposing an exchange," Dr. Vasquez said slowly. "Their freedom for their knowledge." "I'm proposing basic decency," Jake replied. "These cubs are refugees from a war they didn't start. They deserve protection and assistance, not imprisonment and experimentation." Echo joined Pip at the display and began adding new elements to the equations, defensive technologies, and manufacturing techniques that could transform human civilization. But the data stream was clearly conditional, requiring active cooperation from the Cubs to unlock its full potential. "They're showing you what's possible," Jake explained, "but only if you earn their trust instead of trying to force their compliance." Dr. Vasquez lowered her weapon slowly. Around the loading bay, her security team followed suit, though they remained alert and ready to respond to any threat. "Where will you take them?" she asked. "Home," Jake replied simply. "Their people are still out there, still fighting the hegemony. These cubs have families who are probably searching for them right now. The hegemony considers humanity an enemy. If you make contact with these aliens, you could be providing aid and comfort to forces that might eventually attack human colonies." Jay considered this, then looked back at the Cubs. They had been listening to the entire conversation, and he could see in their eyes that they understood the implications of what was being discussed. Quiet stepped forward and made a gesture that Jake recognized as a formal declaration or promise. The young alien moved to the display controls and began entering new information. Star charts showing hegemony positions, tactical assessments of their military capabilities, and, most importantly, communication protocols for contacting the Cubs people safely. They're offering to help, Jake realized, not just with technology, but with intelligence about humanity's enemies. Dr. Vasquez stared at the strategic information flowing across the displays. The tactical data about hegemony forces was more comprehensive and accurate than anything human intelligence had managed to gather. "This changes everything," she whispered. "If we could establish formal diplomatic relations with their species, then maybe both our peoples could survive what's coming," Jake finished. "But only if we start by treating them as allies rather than assets." The standoff stretched for several more minutes as Dr. Vasquez weighed her options. Finally, she activated her communicator. "Security control, this is Dr. Vasquez. Stand down all search teams. The escaped subjects have been located, and the situation is under control." She looked directly at Jake. "You have 12 hours before I'm required to report this incident to Fleet Command. I suggest you use that time wisely." Jake felt a surge of gratitude mixed with determination. 12 hours wasn't much, but it would be enough to reach the coordinates the Cubs had provided for contacting their people. "Thank you," he said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Dr. Vasquez replied. "If this goes badly, we'll all be facing court-martial proceedings. But if it goes well," she gestured to the technical data still flowing across the displays, "we might just save both our species from extinction." Jake and the Cubs boarded the shuttle without further interference. As they lifted off from Research Station Omega-7, Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had won this battle, but the larger war was just beginning. The Cubs gathered around the shuttle's navigation console, working together to input coordinates and communication protocols that would take them to a rendezvous point near the edge of human space. Their people were waiting, and they had stories to tell about the strange species that had helped them when they needed it most. Jake settled into the pilot's seat and began plotting their course. Behind him, the Cubs chittered softly to each other in what he had come to recognize as their planning discussions. They were going home, but they weren't leaving empty-handed. The technical data they had shared with Dr. Vasquez was real and valuable, but it was only a small fraction of what their civilization could offer humanity. The real prize wasn't their technology. It was the possibility of an alliance between species that could stand together against common enemies. As the shuttle entered hyperspace, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 months ago, he had been a simple mechanic following orders and maintaining ships. Now he was potentially the first human ambassador to an alien species, carrying 6 young refugees toward a reunion that could determine the fate of 2 civilizations. Pip approached from the passenger area and settled into the co-pilot's chair, his 4 hands moving across the control interfaces with increasing familiarity. The young alien had been studying human technology intensively, and his understanding of the shuttle systems was already approaching Jake's own level. "You learn fast," Jake observed. Pip responded with a series of gestures that Jake interpreted as questions about human learning methods and educational systems. The conversation that followed, conducted entirely through gestures and simple diagrams, revealed that the Cubs people had very different approaches to knowledge sharing and skill development. In their society, information was freely shared among all members of the community, with specialization emerging naturally based on individual interests and aptitudes. The concept of restricting knowledge or using it as a source of power was foreign to them, which explained their willingness to share advanced technologies with humans they barely knew. It also explained why Dr. Vasquez's research methods had been so traumatic for them. Being isolated and studied as individual specimens violated fundamental principles of their social structure. The rendezvous coordinates led them to a region of space that appeared empty on all human star charts. But as they approached, Jake's instruments began detecting artificial structures hidden among the cosmic debris of an ancient asteroid field. "Your people have been here all along," Jake realized, studying the sensor readings. Watching, waiting, gathering intelligence about human space. Pip confirmed this with a gesture that Jake interpreted as cautious observation and assessment. The Cubs people had been monitoring human expansion for years, trying to determine whether humanity represented a potential ally or another threat to be dealt with. The first contact protocols were more complex than Jake had expected. The Cubs ship had to transmit specific codes and identification patterns, then wait for authorization to approach the hidden base. The entire process took nearly 4 hours, during which Jake found himself wondering whether he was about to become the first human to establish peaceful relations with an alien species, or the first human to be captured by potential enemies of Earth. When authorization finally came through, they were guided to a docking facility that was clearly designed for ships much smaller than most human vessels. Jake had to carefully maneuver the shuttle through an approach corridor that would have been impossible for anything larger than a fighter craft. The docking bay they entered was filled with ships of the same organic design as the Cubs' original vessel, but these were intact and functional. Jake counted at least 30 ships, suggesting a significant population hidden within the asteroid field. As they disembarked from the shuttle, Jake found himself facing the first adult members of the Cub species he had encountered since the rescue. They were larger and more imposing than he had expected, their natural armor more pronounced, and their forearms clearly adapted for both fine manipulation and combat effectiveness. But their demeanor toward the Cubs was unmistakably parental. The reunion that followed was both joyous and heartbreaking, as the Cubs were swept up in embraces that spoke of weeks of worry and fear finally resolved. Jake stood awkwardly to one side, uncertain of his role in this family reunion. He was relieved when one of the adults approached him, making what he recognized as formal greeting gestures. The adult alien was clearly a leader of some kind, possibly the equivalent of a ship captain or military commander. Through Pip, who acted as translator, Jake learned that this was indeed the Cubs' rescue fleet, composed of family members and clan leaders who had been searching for the missing children since the attack on their original ship. The conversation that followed, mediated through the Cubs' growing understanding of human language and gesture, lasted for hours. Jake found himself explaining not just the immediate circumstances of the rescue, but the broader political and military situation in human space. The aliens, who called themselves the Kethvar, had been engaged in their own war against the hegemony for decades. Their people were refugees from conquered worlds, driven from their homes by the same militant coalition that threatened human colonies. "We have a common enemy," Jake realized as the discussion progressed. The hegemony wants to destroy anyone who won't submit to their authority. The Kethvar leader responded with what Jake interpreted as agreement mixed with caution. Their people have been betrayed by potential allies before, and they were reluctant to trust another species without careful evaluation. But the Cubs had been preparing for this moment. During their weeks of captivity, they had been observing and analyzing human behavior, gathering intelligence about humanity's capabilities and intentions. Their assessment, delivered through a combination of technical data and behavioral observations, painted a picture of a species that could be trusted with careful cooperation. The formal negotiations took place over several days. Jake found himself in the unprecedented position of representing humanity in discussions about military cooperation, technology sharing, and mutual defense agreements. He was painfully aware that he had no authority to make commitments on behalf of the Terran Defense Corps, but he also knew that this might be humanity's only chance to establish relations with a potential ally. The agreement they eventually reached was elegantly simple. The Kethvar would establish a formal embassy on a neutral world in unclaimed space, where human and Kethvar representatives could meet safely. In exchange, humanity would provide intelligence about hegemony activities in human space, while the Kethvar would share selected technologies and tactical information. Most importantly, both species would commit to defending each other's civilian populations against hegemony attacks, turning two separate wars of survival into a coordinated resistance movement. Jake's role in the arrangement was equally significant. He would serve as the human liaison to the Kethvar embassy, responsible for maintaining communication and coordinating joint operations. It was a position that would effectively exile him from human space, but it was also an opportunity to build something unprecedented in galactic politics. As Jake prepared to return to human space to deliver the Kethvar proposal to Fleet Command, he reflected on the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. It had started with a simple choice to help when help was needed, regardless of the potential consequences. That choice had grown into something much larger, the possibility of an alliance that could transform the balance of power in the galaxy. The hegemony had counted on keeping their enemies isolated and, afraid, picking them off one by one. The alliance between humanity and the Kethvar would demonstrate that cooperation was possible, even between species that had never met before. Pip and the other Cubs insisted on accompanying Jake back to human space, serving as ambassadors for their people and living proof of the potential for cooperation. They had grown during their time in human hands, developing new skills and perspectives that made them uniquely qualified for diplomatic roles. As Jake's shuttle departed the hidden Kethvar base, he found himself thinking about Dr. Vasquez and her research team. They had been wrong about many things, but they had been right about one crucial point. The Cubs were indeed valuable beyond measure, not as test subjects or intelligence assets, but as bridges between two civilizations that desperately needed each other. The galaxy was a dangerous place, filled with forces that sought to destroy anyone who was different. But it was also a place where unlikely allies could find each other and stand together against the darkness. Jake Morrison had started this journey as a mechanic who couldn't ignore a distress call. He was ending it as humanity's first alien ambassador, carrying the hope of two species toward an uncertain but promising future. The Cubs chittered softly among themselves as Earth grew larger in the shuttle's view screen. Their excitement about this new adventure mixed with the bittersweet knowledge that they were leaving their families behind once again. But this time, they weren't alone. They had each other, and they had a human friend who had proven that sometimes the most important repairs weren't made to machines. They were made to the connections between living beings who chose to trust each other despite their differences. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since the war began, it was also hopeful.